This is a podcast overview for the objectives on Chapter 5, Attitudes. So number 1, you want to describe what attitudes are and why they are of interest to social psychologists. What makes social psychologists want to study attitudes? What can they tell us about people and people's behavior? 2, outline the ways in which we might acquire attitudes through learning. So we've talked in previous chapters about things like operant conditioning, classical conditioning, modeling, and observational learning. These are all ways that we learn, either through our behavior and its consequences, or through paired associations, or through watching other people. But in doing so, in each one of those ways, we acquire attitudes about things. So you'll want to be familiar with the different venues with which an attitude can be acquired. 3, discuss the role of social comparison in attitude acquisition. So we've talked in the last chapter about social comparison and how we often do that to tell ourselves, how we're doing compared to everybody else. It gives us a benchmark for our own behavior and our own sort of ways of being. And so what role does that play when we are acquiring an attitude about something, when we're trying to decide maybe what we think about something? 4, explain how reference groups are used in forming attitudes and retaining beliefs. When we form an attitude about someone or something, and we form a belief about someone or something, we often do it not in a bubble. We do it because we have been informed by others. We have groups that we use for context, groups that might tell us how we should think or what we should do. Those groups could be family, those groups could be peers, schools, media, and so forth. So how do reference groups affect our formation of our attitudes and how we retain certain beliefs? Discuss the basic functions that attitudes might serve. 6, outline the role of the context in the link between attitudes and behavior. So how is an attitude linked to a behavior? Describe the aspects of attitudes themselves and how they may influence behavior. What things about an attitude contribute to the formation of our behavior or acting on those attitudes that we hold. 8, explain the concept of pluralistic ignorance and how it operates in our behaviors. We've already talked about pluralistic ignorance, but it makes an appearance again here because it does affect how we behave. Pluralistic ignorance is an attitude. It's a belief and opinion about what others are thinking, and it's often wrong. It's often ill-informed. That's why it's called ignorance. And yet it still has a powerful force on how we behave. So 9, summarize how the theories of reasoned action and planned behavior and the attitude to behavior process model try to understand the attitude behavior link. So these are 3 models, right? Number 1, the theory of reasoned action. Number 2, theory of reasoned action and planned behavior is one model in and of itself. And then the attitude to behavior process model. So there's 2. Those 2 models are just people's understanding of how we have an attitude and it translates into a behavior. So they've tried to, researchers, social psychologists have tried to kind of map out for us what that might look like. So they've proposed 2 models that help us understand that process a little bit better. 10, state the key factors that social psychologists have historically believed led to successful persuasion. So here's where we move into the research area of persuasion. What factors help someone to be persuasive? Okay. 11, just contrast the systematic and heuristic processing in terms of how they relate to persuasion. So here we're talking about the central and peripheral routes to persuasion. This is actually in one of the Khan Academy videos. A lot of this content are in the Khan Academy videos I've posted, but there's different ways in which we process information centrally and and what that means. And depending upon how we process that information, it is going to either make us more or less susceptible to persuasion and persuasive tactics. So understand that. 12, describe why and how we may resist persuasion by discussing reactance, forewarning, and selective avoidance. So those are kind of three concepts that a person can enact or employ any one of those strategies to help be more resistant to persuasive tactics. 13, understand the use of fear appeals in persuasion. Are they effective and why? So when using persuasion, does fear work well? If we're trying to get someone to do something, which is persuasion, can we fear them into it? Do fear tactics work? 14, consider when we experience cognitive dissonance, how can we reduce it? And whether it is unpleasant for most individuals. So how do most people feel when they experience a state of cognitive dissonance? So when their attitudes and opinions do not line up with their behavior, how does it make people feel? Is it unpleasant for them? Is it not? If they want to reduce it, if they realize a discrepancy between their attitude and their behaviors, can they reduce it, and how might they do that? 15, understand the less leads to more effect by paying particular attention to the famous Festinger and Carl Smith study, which is discussed in your book. And it's basically a principle that helps us understand our attitudes and how we hang on to them versus maybe not hang on to other attitudes. So it's all involved in attitude formation. So it's just a model that helps us understand where that all goes. And it's kind of a pretty famous study in the area of social psychology because it involves people thinking something and then behaving in a different way. So it's cognitive dissonance, but yet the people aren't necessarily aware that it's even happening to them. So I want to read about that study. And then from it came this less leads to more effect. And then lastly, explain how hypocrisy can be used in a manner that produces beneficial effects. So when we point out the hypocrisy in somebody, typically people don't respond very well to that, but we can do it in a way that people might respond well to it. Think of like health scenarios, of sort of using hypocrisy to get somebody to eat healthier or exercise more or take their medicine. That's just one example. So we can kind of turn it around and use it to our benefit in an applied way. This is a good example of a way that social psychology and its understanding of attitudes and behavior can be used in an applied way to help people in many different areas. And that concludes the objectives for Chapter 5.